Welcome back to another Campfire Stories, presented by the Malden Public Library. I'm only popping in briefly to introduce Lily's show tonight. Way back when, we decided to rebrand, and we lost the ghost from our title, to give more flexibility in the stories that we tell. But since then, the ghosts have hung around. Tonight, we're taking advantage of our rebrand to let Lily tell you a true story about the RMS Titanic in honor of the anniversary of its sinking on the early morning of April 15th, 1912. For those of you who like math, that's 109 years ago this year. This isn't a ghost story, but some really interesting facts from an event in history that still haunts the popular imagination. Lily is also going to tell you about one famous woman whose survival that night and subsequent adventures are sure to inspire and amuse you. So, in honor of the 109th anniversary of the Titanic's sinking, and without further blah blah blah, here is Lily.
Hello, my name is Lily from the Malden Public Library. I'd like to talk to you about the RMS Titanic. April 16th was the 109th anniversary of the disastrous end to the Titanic's first and last voyage. For anyone who needs a refresher, the RMS Titanic was a luxury steamship owned by White Star Line that had been dubbed the unsinkable ship, which is kind of like saying, well, this will be fine as long as nothing bad happens. A guaranteed jinx. While making its way to the New York harbor, the Titanic hit an iceberg on April 15, 1912, and began its descent into the depths of the sea. By April 16th, the Titanic was completely submerged. The design of the ship, lauded by many, including Shipbuilder magazine, actually contributed to its horrible fate. Long story short, they made their 15 bulkhead compartments watertight. Great. But built the walls separating the bulkheads only a few feet above the waterline, allowing water to pour into the compartments if the ship, say, listed or pitched. You know, a thing that never happens to ships on the ocean. And that's called sarcasm, folks. But there were many other factors that contributed to the horrendous loss of life that night. The Titanic was equipped with only 20 lifeboats. In total, these could accommodate 1,178 people, while the Titanic could carry more than 3,300 people, including crew. On its maiden voyage, the Titanic was carrying 2,240 passengers and crew. If you know your 123s, you have no doubt already identified the problem. The death toll was made even worse because that 1,178 people the lifeboats could have held that I told you about? Yeah. That's the number if each lifeboat was filled to capacity. The lifeboats that night were very much not filled to capacity. There had been a lifeboat drill scheduled earlier that day, but it was canceled. As a result, the crew was afraid that the davits couldn't support the weight of fully filled boats. They could. The order was women and children first. Some men tried to sneak into the boats, but were shamed or manhandled into getting out. Once all the lifeboats had been lowered into the water, people left aboard the Titanic began leaping overboard in the hopes that they would fare better in the freezing waters than on the sinking ship. Those in the lifeboats knew that they could fit more people in with them, but most chose not to attempt to rescue anyone in the water due to fears of rocking the boat, one might say. Most of those in the water died of exposure. You would not be accused of hyperbole if you called the emergency plan enacted by the crew that night a dumpster fire on wheels careening towards an oil refinery. People truly believed the ship was unsinkable and that it was utter nonsense to be dragged out of their beds. Even crew members, such as Violet Jessop, the most interesting person ever, more on her later, thought they would be back in their cabins before long. Obviously, that was not to be the case. It is important to note here that the Titanic was ahead of its time in terms of how many lifeboats it carried, and the size of its cabins for second and third class passengers. In fact, it's treatment of second and third class passengers was significantly better than the standard at the time. Think about that. The number of lifeboats it carried exceeded the British Board of Trade's requirements for lifeboats. So that's cute. Though the Titanic sent out many distress calls, genuinely begging anyone who could hear them for help, the only ship that came to the rescue was the Carpathia. Sadly, the Carpathia was quite a ways away when it received the distress call, and though they hoofed it over to the Titanic's location as fast as they could, they were still limited by the laws of time and space. And they also had to carefully navigate around those icebergs. Yeah, remember the icebergs? Yikes. The Carpathia arrived more than an hour after the Titanic had disappeared beneath the waves and was able to save 705 people. More than 1,500 had perished. Now, let's turn to how this international tragedy was covered locally. The Malden Evening News did not acknowledge the Titanic sinking until April 18th, and then it was a 2-inch column on page 4 that read, "The disaster to the Titanic will be looked into by the British Admiralty Court. Owned by American capital, supported and made possible by American tourists, she carried the flag of Great Britain. There is nothing we can do or say about the disaster. It is all in the hands of the British. There is no doubt, however, that the British Court of Inquiry will go into every detail and be most exhaustive. We shall want to know why her officers didn't know they were near such an enormous iceberg as she must have struck. We shall want to know why she did not carry more lifeboats. We shall want to know why the White Star officers in New York did not tell the public the truth instead of giving out that story about her being able to go into Halifax. And then, we shall want to know if this avaricious competition in building these great liners has not already gone beyond the limits of practical safety." So, there you have it. In the following days, much was made in the Malden Evening News of the pastors in the community preaching about the event and holding memorials. Now, the two articles that I found basically say the same thing, so I'm not going to read them to you, but I did want to read an excerpt from one of these articles. It's titled, "Memorials for Titanic." And then the many subtitles are, "Malden pastors refer to great ocean disaster and offer prayers for families of lost crew and passengers. Reverend Dr. French wants more lifeboats and rafts. Baptist church people adopt resolutions. Many congregations sing Nearer My God to Thee. Heroism praised and line condemned." So that's nice. And obviously them being pastors, they related it all back to God. That's their job. But I'd like to draw your attention to this particularly interesting part. This is under Center Methodist. So this is what the pastor at the Center Methodist Church said. At the Center Methodist Church, Reverend Dr. Bugby said in part, "The behavior of the passengers and crew of the Titanic is the highest possible tribute to the influence of Christian civilization. Christianity has developed the power of self-control, the spirit of chivalry, and the deepest reverence for womanhood and childhood, and those virtues were preeminently displayed on board the Titanic during those terrible hours of impending disaster. The heroism which prompted men to do their uttermost duty and to stand back in orderly and quiet manner while women and children were firmly but courteously placed in boats, and the spirit which prompted the same treatment for the women and children of the steerage as for those of the first cabin, the spirit which enabled the ship's musicians to play on while the engulfing waters crept to their knees, the spirit of sacrifice and the consideration and chivalry which seems to have characterized the whole tragic story, is undeniably the product of centuries of Christian discipline and training. It is very doubtful if an equal number of Buddhists, Mohammedans, or adherents of any other faith would have acted with the heroism and the chivalry which characterized this company of people who were the products of a Christian civilization." Now, don't get me wrong. There were plenty of people who deserved to be praised. They acted very bravely. Men and women, both on board the Titanic and in the lifeboats. But there was a lot of blame to go around. A lot of blame. They could blame White Star Line. They could blame British Trade Board for that ridiculous requirement. They could blame the designer of the ship, the builders of the ship. They could blame... I mean, it just goes on and on. I mean, there's even the Californian, and I know that this is not set in stone. People still debate this, but the Californian was like 20 nautical miles away, and it watched the Titanic sink and did not even attempt to head over and help them. It just stayed where it was and watched. Literally, the crew were like, huh, those look like distress rockets, eh? Wow. Really lights up the night. So, you doing anything later? Like, it was just nuts. So much blame to go around. So I'm not really sure why this pastor decided his best bet was to put down people of other faiths. Like, why? It's so obnoxious and so offensive. I read it and was honestly stunned. I just can't. Again, I mean, you could really shame a lot of people for their actions that legitimately led to the loss of more than 1,500 people. But instead, he calls out Buddhists and Muslims and is like, well, they're not brave or chivalrous. Anyway, it bummed me out. So that was Malden's coverage. But globally, this terrible tragedy held a fascination for many, many people, and in fact has ever since it happened. But it was hardly the last great shipwreck to happen in that decade, much less that century. Here are some examples. The Lusitania, a commercial liner carrying nearly 2,000 passengers, was struck by a German U-boat and sank in 1915. The HMHS Britannic, sister ship of the Titanic, was used as a hospital ship during World War I and sank in 1916 after hitting a mine. The Carpathia, savior of the few remaining survivors, was sunk by a German U-boat in 1918. In 1945, the USS Indianapolis was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. About 900 men out of the roughly 1,200 on board survived the sinking, only to be trapped in shark-infested waters for days awaiting rescue. By the time help arrived, only 316 men remained. These are just a handful of examples. And maybe tonight, you can raise a glass in memory of the souls lost 109 years ago. Psst, are you still here? Excellent. You've made it through the end credits, so here is your bonus scene. Following is a brief timeline of events in the life of Violet Jessop, the most interesting person you've never heard of. To begin, Violet was born in Argentina to Irish immigrant parents. As a child, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. The doctor said, hey, she's not going to make it, but oh boy, did she make it. As she got older, she decided she wanted to work on ships. She started out working for the Royal Mail Line, but by 1911 she had started working for none other than White Star Line. She served on the Olympic to start. The Olympic was a sister ship to the Titanic. Remember that. She was serving on board the Olympic when it collided with the Hawke, Hawke, another ship. No fatalities, nothing sank, everything was cool, but she was still on a ship when it collided with another ship. Have you ever driven a bumper car? Okay, imagine that times 1,000,000. By 1912, she had joined the crew of the brand spanking new Titanic. You know how this story goes. She wakes up as the ship hits the iceberg. Ugh, nails against a chalkboard, am I right? She goes up on deck and is immediately told to demonstrate what people were supposed to be doing for the passengers who didn't speak English and who might be confused by the orders being screamed at them by a frantic crew. She winds up in a lifeboat. She gets rescued by the Carpathia. Awesome. Are you thinking that now might be the time for Violet to make a career change? Because she certainly wasn't thinking that. She went back to serving on the Olympic. In 1914, she rejoined the Landlubbers to train as a nurse, because World War I, and she then served on the Britannic, the other sister ship of the Titanic. In 1916, the Britannic struck a mine. People had learned a little something since the Titanic, and they sprang into action. Violet grabs a toothbrush because she remembers really wishing she had had one aboard the Carpathia. I sympathize so deeply. And she hightails it to the lifeboats, which are being filled and lowered. Meanwhile, Back at the ranch, the Britannic's captain, known as Iceberg Charlie, I guess Whiteline had really tailored their requirements for captains since 1912, decided that they were close enough to land to maybe make it, so he guns it. Unfortunately, old Iceberg C didn't realize lifeboats had already been lowered. The propellers of the ship were going like wild and created a whirlpool that was sucking the lifeboats into it. The boats and people were then chopped up by the propellers. Can you even imagine? Dear Lord. So, people in these lifeboats are watching what is happening to the others, and they see the writing on the wall. Everyone aboard Violet's lifeboat makes the sensible decision to jump out of the boat before it gets too close to the whirlpool of nightmares. Very much a not today Satan move. Violet has to think about her next move a little longer than her fellows because, you see, despite having worked on ships for 8 years, Violet did not know how to swim. Couldn't swim, didn't know how. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. At the last second, she decides to jump. She gets sucked into the whirlpool and hits her head on the keel, but by a miracle, she survives. Again! This is why they call her Miss Unsinkable. Years later, she visits her doctor and mentions having chronic headaches, and her doctor says, yeah, I see here that your skull was fractured at some point. I wonder when. Violet continued to work on ships until 1950 when she retired at the age of 61. She spent the rest of her life in her cottage, raising chickens and exuding awesomeness. She died in the 1970s, but not before she wrote Titanic Survivor, the memoirs of Violet Jessop. As a librarian, I wish so badly that I could tell you to request it through the library, but no one in the state owns it. I know, I've looked. There are plenty of articles online now, and there may even be some videos on YouTube about her life, so go hunting for that information. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.